Hello, beautiful community. You're very welcome to this video that's going to take a while. So you could want to settle in, maybe. And it's going to be about why Mr. Putin cannot tolerate the very existence of Ukraine. And it's going to include a small bit of psychoanalysis of Putin that I'm going to share with you maybe in about 15-20 minutes as we get through this video. But the main focus of our time together today is going to be reading together a piece that Peter Pomerantsev wrote in The Guardian a few weeks ago about the sources of Russia's destructive violence and how, well, at least that's what the headline said, a Freudian analysis might help us make sense of it. There is going to be very little deep Freudian analysis here, so don't worry about this. Now, what we don't do when we do this is give people a score out of 10. That's not the point. The point is not to give people a scorecard and tell them that they did a great job with their little article or they did a terrible job. The point is for you to grow, right? And for us to practice with openness the art of reading something, right, about this story we're all following, this extraordinary, feverish, imperial self-immolation that Mr. Putin is engaging in, right? So what we're going to try to come away with is all about how we read, how we think, how we decently and openly react to the world around us. And that is going to be our emphasis. And indeed how public intellectuals or people who are in our information environment help us with these tasks. Now, that means that there's no question of giving a cumulative assessment of Peter's contribution to our world either. That's not what we're going to be about today. Having said this, I think Peter's contribution is distinctive and overwhelmingly positive across a stretch of interconnected pockets. He's helped us a lot to make sense of Russian propaganda and how it is part of an organic global trend of post-truth and kind of a postmodern communication. A lot of you have Peter's books, This Is Not Propaganda, and Everything, Everything, Nothing, Nothing. Nothing, nothing, everything, everything. Nothing is true and everything is possible. Now, Peter has also done a lot to help us understand this. How we negotiate the algorithmic environment and what urgent questions of democratic accountability arise when we think about the state of whatever we call this, our public squares on the internet. Peter also gets really, really beautifully some key issues like the climate crisis. So, this is, none of that will be questioned in this conversation. Let's go. Beneath the veneer of Russian military tactics, you see the stupid leer of destruction for the sake of it. That's the first sentence. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to share this piece with you. It's got heavily criticized, but also quite a few people valued it and shared it. And we'll come to some of the criticisms it received in a moment. This is a very important sentence. It's a sentence about negative capability. And we've talked about this in a few connections, including in connection with Nazi Germany, right? There is a kind of a tendency for good people like you to think that terrible things happening in the world is a case of human beings trying to do good but going really terribly, horrifically wrong with that enterprise and ending up doing evil. And of course that's absurd because we have so many destructive as well as constructive capabilities, right? And the last time we talked about this, we made some jokes about how absurd it would be to try to cast the Nazis in terms of positive values gone wrong, right? You could end up saying sort of rather frivolous things about the real continuity, right, of Nazi Germany with European virtues, European values. And however, you're going to say that what it's just an expression of love of country gone wrong plus false empirical views about the Jews, right? You fast descend into sort of absurd superficiality unless you acknowledge our destructive capabilities. And that's, I think, the central thing about what Peter wrote and why it's so important. And it's not that this point is particularly sophisticated as a point to make, it's just it's so rarely made and so often is a point that we are all half aware of but are inclined to forget about. The Kremlin, Peter goes on, can't create, so all that is left is to destroy. Not in some pseudo-glorious self-immolation. The people behind the atrocities are petty cowards, but more like a loser smearing their feces over life. I want to assess that sentence, but let me just say two things. First of all, we're talking about a newspaper article, right? We're not talking about a philosophical treatise. And yes, a newspaper article is much more intentional and enterprise than a YouTube comment, but it's a less intentional enterprise than a book. So I'm not going to over milk this image, but I want to say something in defense of talking about feces and talking about shit in general. I think that can be psychoanalytically illuminating, both in a constructive and in a destructive light, right? And you know, Lizzie Anscombe, important 20th century philosopher, follower of Wittgenstein, once wrote, I think in a paper about pleasures, about the pleasure of taking good shit, circa 1950, and people were outraged by that, but that was in fact a perfectly benign thing to talk about. In Russia's wars, the very senselessness seems to be the sense. And this is indeed continuous with our conversation about how Putin's project has nothing to offer. And that doesn't mean that it has little to offer, and what little it has to offer is outweighed by all of the destruction and calamity. It's rather that it is an inherently unconstructive project. We'll say a little bit more about that again today. So Peter is making an important point. Now, in Russia's wars, the very senselessness seems to be the sense. And here, obviously, there is a delicate dance about how far a sentence like that can travel in your reception of it, right? Because you don't want it to travel so far that it makes you feel that Russians are monsters and that they're simply unlike other cultures, whatever that means, and that being monsters, their actions are unintelligible. We precisely want thoroughgoing intelligibility. Well, of course, being ready to admit that there are things we don't know, but we want intelligibility. We don't want placeholders that are evasive instead of true explanation. Peter again. After the casual mass executions at Bucha, am I going to be able to do this without my spectacles? I think so. Let's give it a go. After the casual mass executions at Bucha, after the bombing of maternity wards in Mariupol, after the laying to waste of whole cities in Donbass, after the children's torture chambers, the missiles aimed at freezing civilians to death in the dead of winter, we now have the vast apocalyptic sight of the waters of the Dnipro, a river that when you're on it can feel as wide as a sea, bursting through the destroyed dam at Kakhovka. The reservoir held as much water as the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Its destruction has already submerged settlements where more than 40,000 people live. I think it's June 11th that Peter's writing this. It has already wiped out animal sanctuaries and nature reserves. It will decimate agriculture in the breadbasket of Ukraine that feeds so much of the world, most notably the Middle East and Africa, to Russian genocide and ecocide. I'm not going to comment on genocide at the moment, but we've certainly discussed many times, in particular, the genocidal rhetoric that backs Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Peter again. The dam has been controlled by Russia for more than a year. The Ukrainian government has been warning that Russia had plans to blast it since October. Seismologists in Norway have confirmed that massive blasts, the type associated with explosives rather than an accidental breach, came from the reservoir the night of its destruction. Some, including the American pro-Putin media personality Tucker, argue Russia couldn't be behind the devastation given the damage has spread to Russian-controlled territories, potentially restricting water supply to Crimea. But if Russia wouldn't damage its own people, is your argument, then it's one that doesn't hold, pardon the tactless pun, much water. We're going to get to the substantive bits shortly. One of the least accurate quotes about Russia is Winston Churchill's line about it being a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. The key is Russian national interest. This makes it sound as if Russia is driven by some theory of rational choice, when century after century the opposite appears to be the case. And again, we are teetering on a kind of a delicate border here, it seems. So is something being picked out here that is both sufficiently continuous and more a derivation of things particular to Russian culture than an expression, even if in an intensified form, of global trends and patterns? And now we're getting into the more substantive bits. Few have captured the Russian cycle of self-destruction and destruction of others, as well as the Ukrainian literary critic Tatiana Oharkova in her rewording of Dostoevsky's Russian classic Crime and Punishment, a novel about a murderer who kills simply because he can. Oharkova calls Russia a culture where you have crime without punishment and punishment without crime. And folks are sort of raising their hands with the objection and complaint of cultural essentialism at this point. But we won't join that complaint, at the very least for now, and maybe not fully at all. The powerful murder with impunity. The victims are punished for no reason. When not bringing humanitarian aid to the front lines, Oharkova presents a pod with her husband, the philosopher Vladimir Molenko. It's remarkable for showing two people thinking calmly while under daily bombardment. It reminds me, and this made a lot of people squirm, this sentence, it reminds me of German Jewish philosophers such as Walter Benjamin, who kept writing lucidly even as they fled the Nazis. Now, a piece by Yermolenko has been requested for comment by me. Yermolenko is famous for insisting on a strong connection between the writings of Dostoevsky, Pushkin, Lermontov, and Putin's war. Now, you know what I would think about that. I'm not going to comment, but the only comment I would make here is that if you're a thinking thinker, is I think something similar to what at one time Clive James said about Walter Benjamin, actually, that if you're a thinking thinker, you are owed the right of others not treating you like a hero in a drama. But that's for another time when we discuss Yermolenko's article. As they try to make sense of the evil, and this is another thing I'm very fond of with Peter, that he's put an evil front and center. And you remember we talked about evil in a very concentrated way on the main channel, and the importance of that, in my view, can't be underestimated. And we'll say more about that soon. As they try to make sense of the evil bearing down on their country, Harkov and Yermolenko note the difference between Hitler and Stalin. While Nazis had some rules about who they punished, non-Aryans, communists, in Stalin's terror, anyone could be a victim at any moment. Random violence runs through Russian history. Now, let's say a little bit, because here Peter got accused of minimizing Nazi evil. Because this sounds like him saying, well, at least the Nazis had some rules. So let's break this down a bit. Now, my advice is always to center, just so that there is no doubt, Nazi evil when you're talking about it, especially in a newspaper context, to avert that kind of reaction. Because a lot of people have sincerely reacted to this, feeling uncomfortable with this sentence, so at least the Nazis had some rules. But while it's important to give proper weight to Nazi crimes, even in passing, isn't Peter just right about the basic point that's being made here? And isn't it a substantive point? Yes and no. Primarily yes, but maybe insufficiently yes, which is to say that the evaluative observation that Nazi violence was less random is absolutely right. But it doesn't follow from that, of course, how you should evaluate this. And of course, it's hard to give a quick implication when you write in a very short article. But certainly my view, and that's the view of my colleague Avishai Margalit too, is that while it's certainly unclear that Hitler was more evil than Stalin, I wouldn't want to put my money on anyone in that contest, and if I had to, I might even go with Stalin. But it's clear that there's a strong case to say that Nazi Germany was a more evil regime than Stalin's USSR. And I won't go on about that case, but I'll just remake Peter's point here. The violence that folks were on the wrong end of in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany was qualitatively different at that level of randomness. That is to say, in the Soviet Union, the situation was closer to it being the case that people were coerced into committing evil. The degree to which, there's a better way of putting, the degree to which people who committed evil in the Soviet regime were coerced into committing evil is qualitatively different because of the arbitrariness and universal exposure. Right? It could be taken away no matter who you were, but you could be, as a loyal Nazi, relatively safe in Nazi Germany, at least comparatively. So there is this qualitative difference around the coercion into evil between the two regimes. Right? And that's one of the features that makes the Nazi regime even closer to the paradigm of to certain paradigms of evil than the Soviet regime. It's a messier picture, right, in terms of coercion into evil. Let's go on. Reacting to how Putin's Russia is constantly changing its reasons for invading Ukraine, from denazification to reclaiming historical lands to NATO expansion, Kharkov and Yermolenko decide that the very brutal nature of the invasion is its essence. The war crimes are the point. Russia claims to be a powerful pole in the world to balance the West, but it's failed to create a successful political model others would want to join. Nothing to offer. So it has nothing left to offer except to drag everyone down to its own depths. How dare you live like this, went a resentful piece of graffiti by Russian soldiers in Bucha. What's the point of the world when there is no place for Russia in it, complains Putin. After the dam at Kakhovka was destroyed, General Dobrezhinsky crowd on a popular Russian talk show, we should blow up the Kiev water reservoir too. Why? Asked the host. Just to show them. But as Kharkov and Yermolenko explore, Russians also send their soldiers to die senselessly in the meat grinder of the Donbass, their bodies left uncollected on the battlefield, their relatives not informed of their death so as to avoid paying them. On TV, presenters praise how no one knows how to die like us. Meanwhile, villages on the Russian-occupied side of the river are being abandoned by the authorities. Being liberated by Russia means joining its empire of humiliation. And now the real substance comes. Where does this drive to annihilation come from? In 1912, the Russian Jewish psychoanalyst Sabina Spielrein, who was murdered by the Nazis, while her three brothers were killed in Stalin's terror, first put forward the idea that people were drawn to death as much as to life. She drew on themes from Russian literature and folklore for her theory of a death drive. But the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, first found her ideas too morbid. After the First World War, he came to agree with her. The desire for death was the desire to let go of responsibility, the burden of individuality, choice, freedom, and sink back into inorganic matter, to just give up. In a culture such as Russia's, where avoiding facing up to the dark past with all its complex webs of guilt and responsibility is commonplace, such oblivion can be especially seductive. And this is the bit that generated the most criticism. Let's break that down. Now, the criticism was basically Russians are bad because Freud told me so. As Jeremy Morris put it, saying that violence is a universal element of culture and history of a particular state is simply meaningless. That's an insufficient response for me. So the problem is that there might be things that are problematic with what Peter's done here, but they are not well illuminated by saying cultural essentialism. And well, what is cultural essentialism, right? And what isn't cultural essentialism? That's what we're going to break down right now. So here in the margins I've jotted down a note, and we'll go through it. What is Peter committed to in virtue of the paragraph he's just written? Well, the first thing he's committed to is that something like psychoanalytic explanation is valid. And that's a solid commitment. Second thing he's committed to, commitment B, is that psychopathology is not equally distributed across societies. I'll separately do a video on that. That's a very important point, actually. And nearly irresistible, right? Once you look at very, very different contexts in which human beings find themselves for prolonged periods of history. C, B and A, the first 2 points, are true because the social conditions present in human cultures vary. Right? So we've got something like psychoanalytic explanation that could pick out psychopathology. Not all cultures have an equal sort of distribution with other cultures of psychopathology, and that's for reasons of sustained and different social conditions in different cultural circumstances. ABC. D, Russia historically expresses these social conditions more than other cultures do. And that, presumably, once properly answered, is a question that, once properly articulated, is a point that would also give you an answer to the question, are there some social conditions, if sustained for a long enough period, under which you would say that Russia no longer expresses this with such intensity, and that in fact other countries express it more? The next thing that Peter is committed to, but we don't want to overburden him too much. He's not giving us a philosophical thesis here. And this is point E. The specific psychopathology elicited with greater intensity by these social conditions in Russia is something to do with the death drive. I'll say a bit about that in a moment. And then F, all of the above explains Putin's war to some substantive extent. Now, we've just said that A and B and C are true. What about D? Russia historically expresses these social conditions more than other cultures do. Is that true? And here I don't want to spend too much time on this. Let me just briefly say that there is plenty that is quite sick about Russian culture. Right? At the same time, one striking feature of Russian culture is a kind of generational gap. And so when it comes to some of these disturbances, it may be that very, very many younger Russians are closer to, let's say, Ukrainians than to older Russians. But there's something more specific at stake here, which is the death drive. So let me say a little bit. Let me say a little bit about it. Even though in this chat with you, what I want to do is actually manifest psychoanalytic insight, which we'll do in a moment when I'll give you a kind of psychoanalytic reading of a sketch of a psychoanalytic reading of Putin's incapacity to tolerate Ukraine. Now, roughly, the death instinct is a kind of disaster for Freud. I mean, Freud is arguably as misunderstood as any intellectual figure in our culture, even more misunderstood than Nietzsche. You can sympathize with some of the misunderstandings because there's various traditions that descend from Freud that have done quite a bit of harm, actually. But nevertheless, Freud is a figure with an enormous amount to give to us, and much of what he has to give to us is transformational once you take it properly. That's to say, you take it via people who followed him and people who followed those people, and they made sense of things that Freud himself could not make sense of, but in something like in his spirit. Freud came to acknowledge, just like Peter pointed out, that he needed some new explanatory resources for various disruptive forces in the psyche, and that's when he postulates the death drive, which is a kind of tendency that we all supposedly have to fall apart and decompose. And what then happens is that we expel and externalize that onto the world around us, and that is how aggression works. So that makes aggression a kind of secondary derivative phenomenon. And quite frankly, that's ridiculous. So Freud's death drive, in fact, doesn't just give a bad answer, but simply omits giving us a compelling psychodynamic picture of the psychological and the social evolution of formation of aggression. But what Freud couldn't do roughly did get done, and I would here want to go in the direction of Melanie Klein and the post-Kleinians who followed her, but we won't talk about that. So that's the death drive, and I think, in my opinion, it is something that I want to leave behind. Next, let's raise an even bigger question, potentially, in terms of what worries us here. And that is, well, whatever the shape of the psychoanalytic story we sellotaped here, how the hell does that explain the war? And here what we want to do is take what I call a kind of a three-stage approach, or a 1 + 3 + 1 approach. The three is that we, of course, want psychological explanation, but then we also want cultural historical explanation, and then we also want social, or if you like, sociological explanation. Right? The one that comes after that three is the I don't know. It's very important to say I don't know when we're trying to explain things. And the one that comes before the three is, of course, biology and evolution. So let's say quickly a little about each of these categories, but not too much, because at the end of this video, if you're still alive, I'm going to attach, in case you haven't seen it, the 20-minute video about making sense of evil and making sense of the evil of Putin's war that we did on the main channel a couple of months ago, where I broke down social versus psychological versus cultural historical explanation. Let's say something brief. Now, absolutely, human beings have a universal psychology that's been produced by evolution. There is no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean you can explain what human beings do, right, without these explanations being deeply internal to culture. I mean, right, I caught the other day an evolutionary psychologist on YouTube trying to explain the Second World War in terms of universal features of human psychology, and obviously that led to profound embarrassment. But of course there is a universal psychology, but what's also true is that the central evolutionary achievement of human beings is that we live under culture. And it is a feature of evolutionary explanation that it does not explain what happens inside cultures, even though it explains that too. It explains that it doesn't explain what happens inside cultures. And that might leave you in something like the following story. You could explain why human beings make art, but you can't explain the formation of certain literary or painterly or musical traditions, right? There's nothing that evolutionary theory can tell you about the breakdown of the tonal system around the time of the First World War. And of course, if you did try to explain in purely universal evolutionary terms a war, right, you'd be at risk of ending up with results that would be so embarrassing as to not be much of an improvement on equating the war with some kind of territorial dispute a pack of wolves might have with another pack of wolves. That's obviously not going to help us. Yeah. But we accept the universal psychology, but acknowledge that it's expressed in different ways in different cultural circumstances. And here we reach something like psychological explanation, about which we just said a little. Right? After psychological explanation, we reach social or sociological explanation, and then we get to cultural historical explanation. Well, what's the difference? Well, cultural historical explanation would be the sort of story we told in our video about Crimea and the Russian imperial myths about Crimea, right? So that's very much a sort of cultural narrative, how Crimea is Russia's sort of mysterious way of being connected to the ancient world and so on. So when we do cultural historical explanations, we're very much focused on processes, patterns that are internal to a particular culture. When we do social explanation, we tend to focus on patterns that might be contingent, but they are contingent in some slightly more global way than the particularity of a culture. We might look at patterns of human organization in the modern world, right? And indeed, we might look to some universal explanation, just general features of how power works. And that's not going to be about whether you are in Russia or in China or in Canada, right? There are just certain ways in which power works. There are going to be certain ways in which institutions work, and that is social explanation. And you need all of these pillars of explanation. Without them, you won't be able to explain anything. You need to have a sort of a respect for the depth, the breadth of the explanatory economy as something that contains all of these modes of explanation that relate to one another complexly and blurrily too. It's time to psychoanalyze Mr. Putin. And this is really going to be the center point of this video. Because what we've said before was an analytical set of remarks about very brief, couple of analytical remarks about the death drive and psychoanalytic explanation. But what I want to do now is actually give you a taste of psychoanalytic explanation in action, and it's deliberately going to be delivered in sort of almost aphoristic note form. And we're not pathologizing the Russian population, we're pathologizing, in this case, Vladimir Putin. Now, there is a video on the main channel from before the war where I list something like 15 psychological traits of Putin's. But none of these remarks were psychoanalytical. This one will be. So let's go. What Putin can't bear is a Ukraine that is a post-2014 Ukraine. Right? I mean, that's when history begins that he cannot cope with. And he wants to take the world back. Right? Even though there is no coherent way to imagine that in principle, let alone in practice via a war. Putin is not able to see Ukraine and Russia's relationship with Ukraine as an evolutionary thing, as something that evolves across time in a way that you can't entirely control. Putin is a man who has lost the capacity to tolerate doubt in relation to Ukraine's future. The not yet existent about Ukraine he finds unbearable. When it comes to Ukraine, Putin's relationship with the unknown is broken. He can't find himself in this. His world is too claustrophobic to accept the inevitable post-2014 evolution of Ukraine. So it's as though he reached a kind of boundary in 2014 and can't go further. And because he can't go further, Ukraine may need to be destroyed. Ukraine's evolution and Ukraine's conversation with itself, about itself, are unbearable. This is imprisonment in infantile omnipotence. Putin probably suffered from it in childhood, but the grandiosity and isolation that come with long unchecked power have made it incomparably worse. The last couple of paragraphs from Peter and then my conclusion. But Russia is also sending out a similar message to Ukrainians and their allies with these acts of ultra-violent biblical destruction. Give in to our immensity, surrender your struggle. And for all Russia's military defeats and actual socioeconomic fragility, this propaganda of the deed can still work. The reaction in the West to the explosion of the dam has been weirdly muted. Ukraine are mounting remarkable rescue operations while Russia continues to shell semi-submerged cities. But they're doing it more or less alone. Ukraine's President Zelensky has been mystified by the quote-unquote zero support from international organizations such as UN and the Red Cross. Perhaps the relative lack of support comes partly because people feel helpless in the face of something so immense, these Cecil B. DeMille-like scenes of giant rivers exploding. It's the same helplessness some people feel when faced with the climate crisis. It's apposite that the strongest response to Russia's ecocide came not from governments, but from the climate activist Greta Thunberg, whose name I can never pronounce. And she clearly said and that we lay the blame for what happened on Russia and demanded Russia to be held accountable. But there's been barely a peep out of Western governments or the UN. And here I want to really acknowledge Peter for both grasping the climate crisis and for not doing the gamification, algorithmic gamification that people did by tweeting at Greta or tweeting at lots of other people. Where are you now, climate activists? As though the destruction of the dam is something that can be, emphasized at the expense of climate advocates and climate communicators by people who themselves haven't said anything about the climate crisis, except in the context of the Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine and the destruction of the dam, right? So the answer to these people who say, well, where were you, climate activists, of course, is even more powerful. And that answer is, well, where were you with the climate crisis, right? And Peter grasps the frivolity of these gambits and puts them aside, and really commend him for that. Last sentence, and in my conclusion: pushing the strange lure of death, oblivion, and just giving up is the Russian gambit. How much life do we have left in us? Question mark. Now, the main criticism that came Peter's way here, apart from the Nazi stuff, is cultural essentialism and stoking up needless, excessive racial hatred at Russians by overgeneralizing. I don't think that's the interesting way to weigh this piece. And because of that, I won't legislate too deeply on this. We've already said a few things about how one needs to separate various modes of explanation in what one writes, and I'm going to leave that conversation to proceed on its own. Instead, I'm going to say two things. The real strength of the piece, so I'm going to put this away now, let's break this down properly. The real strength of the piece for me is this emphasis on negative capability, which is really important. And not the emphasis, which is important too, on the negativeness of Putin's project, that it's got nothing to offer the world, but the emphasis on destructive capabilities, right? And that has not been sufficiently put front and center, right? And there is two things that I think Peter has rightly put front and center. One is this destructive stuff, this negative capability, right? The terrible things being done by people aren't just good intentions going horribly wrong, right? And the second thing is evil, right? And Peter is putting this front and center. And that's the strength of the piece. The weakness of the piece is less the, essentialism or the stoking of hatred. It's that there's an incongruent tension in the middle of the piece. And that's that the piece reaches for psychoanalytic explanation, but it is itself not terribly psychoanalytic in substance. Only it's formally psychoanalytic. It's maybe psychoanalytic in content even. All right, let's give that, but it's not terribly psychoanalytic at all. In fact, in spirit, it does not manifest a psychoanalytically adequate disposition. Why not? Because it's to a good extent an activist piece, right? The activist piece is about the psychoanalytic. Yes, that's that kind of openness. So that's the real, the fragility of the piece, the weakness of the piece is this tension, right, between psychoanalytic claims and psychoanalytic disposition. But let me then say something else about this. We've got to be careful about how and understanding how a lot of the people writing about this are close to it, right? And it's not just that, you know, Peter's born in Ukraine. It's how deeply he's connected to what's going on there, right? And a lot of us are commenting from a distance, and sometimes there is an insufficient understanding of how much it is actually an okay thing to do, to say, oh, those bloody, terrible Russian bastards. Now, for Ukrainians themselves, of course, unqualified rage is understandable at all things Russian. It's not entirely constructive. It would be terrible if that was the only thing that was part of the economy of discourse in Ukraine, and we'll discuss that too. But nevertheless, it's understandable. And you know, even for this conversation, my conversation with you, I'm at a terrible distance from the war. I'm not really affected by it directly at all. But even with this, you know, there was somebody who sat in this very chair who was killed in Irpin by the Russians. Wonderful person from the world of journalism. Imagine multiplying that by quite a lot. So there's also this, you've got to have this empathy to the closeness that some people just how close people are to this conflict, this story. My health is not amazing today, so I've been rambly, but I think we've got everything we wanted to say out of the way. If you're completely out of your mind, then you have unbelievable endurance. I'm going to attach the video about evil that we did on the main channel. It is much more boom, 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 boom than this conversation. It's been lovely to have you. Lots of love. Bye-bye for the moment.